Okay, good day, grade 12. This is the last little section of chapter 11. Those of you that did come to the afternoon classes, this is the very last section on page 166 that I said that I would send a video from. Okay, so the focus of this lesson is the international comparisons. In chapter 11, we looked at economic and social indicators. So now we obviously calculate these indicators so that we can make comparisons between South Africa and other countries so that we can see how we compare. And this lesson, we're just going to focus on those international comparisons. Why do we make economic comparisons? What do we need to remember when we compare the indicators of different countries? Okay, so the first important thing is when we do make international comparisons, what are the things that we need to remember? Okay, the first thing there is that the methods of data collection and the accuracy of calculations vary considerably among countries. Obviously, there are certain things that are standardized, certain calculation methods that are standardized, but not all of them are. So when we do make comparisons, we also need to look at how exactly the data was collected that the indicators are based on, and how accurately those calculations have been done. Now we need to look at the method of calculation to see. We can only really make a comparison between us and another country if the methods of data collection are more or less similar and the accuracy and the way of the calculation is also very similar. Okay, the second problem is that most of these statistics, if it's a monetary statistic, so that will basically refer to your economic indicators more than the social indicators, most of these statistics are given in the national currency of the country in question. So before we can make comparisons between South Africa and another country, obviously we have to convert any monetary values into a common currency, and the currency that they would generally use for that would be the US dollar. Okay, but when we do this, we also have to remember that any common currency, if we express the rand value in terms of the dollar, for example, that will have a different purchasing power from one country to the other. So we cannot assume, literally, we are assuming, but it's wrong to assume that something costing $100 in America is going to cost 1,000 rand in South Africa when we use an exchange rate, for example, of 10 rand to the dollar. All right, so it is not an ideal system, all right, because we are basically just using the current exchange rates, and those exchange rates changes all the times, and when the exchange rate is changing, it doesn't necessarily mean that the purchasing power have changed in that specific country. All right, so when we do this exchange rate conversion, it is a flawed system, all right, because we have no guarantee that when we do the conversion that $1, for example, will have the same purchasing power in America and in South Africa. All right, and then lastly, different conditions obviously exist in different countries. So when we make comparisons to see whether we are improving or not, it is best for South Africa to choose other developing countries with which to compare ourselves because we are facing more or less the same situation. Obviously, if we make a comparison between us and the super industrialized developed nations, we are always going to fall short. All right. We need to find other countries that face more or less the same situation as us, and then we make comparisons between us and those countries. Okay. And then the last thing that we're going to look at just is the reasons. Why do we need to make international comparisons? Why is it so important that we calculate these indicators and then that we use those indicators to compare ourselves against others? And the first reason for that is globalization. All right. Now, obviously, with the volume of international trade that has increased significantly over time, that is where globalization has basically started. All right. So obviously, people that engage in international trade, businesses that engage in international trade, obviously have to monitor exchange rates because that exchange rate changes are going to change what they pay for stuff and what they get for the stuff that they sell. So obviously it is important when we are participating in international trade. If I'm an exporter in South Africa, I need to know what the exchange rates are. I need to know when it's changing because those exchange rates is going to impact on me. If I'm importing raw materials, and the rand depreciates, it means that I'm going to be paying more for my raw materials. It is ultimately going to affect my production cost. It is going to affect my profits. All right, so it's very important that anybody that is involved in international trade understands what is happening with the exchange rate and also understand all the factors that will influence the exchange rate. All right, because obviously if certain things happen, we need to be able to predict what is going to happen with the exchange rate if it is going to affect my business. All right, so they need to understand, for example, the indicator of the terms of trade. We did that, the index figure of the terms of trade, because the terms of trade gives us an indication of what is going to happen with exchange rates in the future. Interest rate changes in different countries will affect their exchange rates as well. All right, so with globalization, last year we spoke about the multinational companies. There are businesses that have offices and factories not just in one country. They have branches of their business in many, many different foreign countries. So obviously if I am a South African business and I have a branch or a factory in Zimbabwe, I need to understand what is happening in Zimbabwe, because it's not just the South African situation that is going to affect my business. If I have offices in other countries, I need to monitor the indicators of those foreign countries so that I can understand what is happening in those economies, so that I can make sure that my business is functioning properly. If I know what the indicators are doing, I can predict certain changes and I can make a plan. Now I can implement a strategy in my business to deal with any local changes there. All right, multinationals also have to publish financial reports. Okay, it's a requirement that is going to list their assets, liabilities, and profits. And if I do this, if I'm a South African company and I publish my financial records, I'm going to publish my income statement, my balance sheet, and I'm going to list my assets, liabilities, and profits in a single currency, which is the rand. If I'm a South African company, I'm going to list this, my financial statements will be determined in rand, okay? But if I have shareholders that live in other countries, I'm going to have to calculate. If I declare a profit, for example, and I have to pay dividends to my shareholders, those shareholders can live anywhere in the world. Okay, remember, if I'm listed on the JSE, anybody in the world is able to buy shares in my company. So once I have declared a profit and I've declared a dividend, I have to now calculate. My dividend will be expressed in rand, but I have to pay dividends to different people living in different countries. So I am going to have to convert into their currency to determine how much dividends I owe them. All right, and globalization is obviously knowledge-based. People make decisions. We live in a knowledge-based era where knowledge is power. So the more knowledge we have access to, obviously, then it helps us to make better decisions. Now we make decisions based on the information at our disposal. And all of this indicators is information that is part of this knowledge base that we need to make informed decisions, to make decisions that is going to be beneficial to my business. Whether my business is here, whether my business have branches overseas, these indicators give me information, what is happening in those various countries, and I need this information to make valid decisions. Right, and then lastly, business cycles also move through the countries in the world. South Africa's business cycle, for example, follows the business cycles of our major trading partners. If you think back to chapter 2 when we did the business cycles, one of our indicators, one of our leading indicators is the leading indicators of our major trading partners. We need to look and see what is happening in Europe, what is happening in America, what's happening in China in terms of their economies, because what is happening in their economies is going to spill over into ours as well. So if our trading partners' economies are showing a contraction, we can expect that the economy in South Africa will contract as well. And as a business person that needs to make decisions for the benefit of my business, I need to know this. Okay? I need to know this so that I can prepare so that my business is not affected too much negatively by this. Right, that's the first reason. The second reason that we do these international comparisons is in terms of international standardizations. I did mention this when we went through the economic and the social indicators, but some of these economic and social indicators are so important that international organizations have specifications on how to compile them. So it is, in other words, prescribed how we need to calculate them so that internationally all countries calculate them in exactly the same way so that we can facilitate these comparisons. Because as I said, if we calculate it differently, there's no way that our comparison can be valid in a case like that. Right, benefits from international aid and funding organizations. Also, this is another heading, we'll talk about that again, might not be given if these indicators are either not available or they show performances that is not warranting aid or funding. So basically, when international aid organizations like the World Bank decides to provide financial help to countries, they look at the indicators. There are certain indicators that they would like to know what it is showing. And if your country cannot provide these indicators because you haven't calculated them, you might not qualify to receive financial aid from international organizations. In another case, you might have your indicators available and your indicator doesn't show a performance. It's not bad enough. In other words, your performance of the country is not bad enough to warrant them providing aid. They obviously have to provide financial help to the countries that need it the most. So they need to look at the indicators to identify the countries that need it the most. Okay, so the three most important international organizations that are involved in standardization of indicators is the IMF, the World Bank, and the United Nations. Okay, with the IMF, the Manual on Government Finance Statistics that focuses on public finance accounting. Basically, this specifies exactly how the budget of different countries need to be compiled. Right, and very important there is that your budget can be based only on transactions that have taken place and not transactions that are expected to happen. All right, so when you do the budget review, not the actual budget, the actual budget is about stuff that hasn't happened yet, that's a projection. But when we do the budget review, when we look at, in hindsight, the following financial year, we need to look at the previous financial year's budget so that we can see how the budget processing went down, how accurately the budgeting was, etc. So when we do that budget review, that is compiled in terms of GFS specifications, when we look at the budget in hindsight. All right, the IMF also specifies exactly how the balance of payments, for example, needs to be compiled, how the terms of trade needs to be compiled. Basically, a lot of indicators that deal with international trade is regulated by the IMF. Okay, then the World Bank. World Bank is in charge basically of economic development. Their focus area is economic development. So they provide definitions for a range of economic and social indicators. So obviously they define exactly what is, for example, access to water. When does a person have access to water? What is the definition of a person that has access to water? We looked at that when we did the actual indicators. All right. So these indicators are then published in the World Development Report and the African Development Indicators. And this is the world's largest source of financial development assistance. As I said, the World Bank is the leading institution in terms of development, standards of living. All right, they will determine, they are the institution that very, very poor countries can approach for assistance, financial assistance to uplift living standards in extremely poor countries. All right, and in the United Nations, the best known manual for the United Nations is the System of National Accounts, the SNA, which is the system that we use to compile our national accounts. Remember, we spoke about this in Chapter 1, where we calculate all our aggregate figures, aggregate production, income and expenditure, GDP, GDI, GDE, GNP, GNI, GNE, all of those are our aggregates. And the United Nations prescribes to us how these aggregates should be calculated. All right. So all the data in the quarterly bulletin of the Reserve Bank also is compiled in terms of the system of national accounts. All the aggregate calculations is specified by the United Nations. All right, and then as I said, for aid and assistance, foreign countries, obviously if a country is developing, very poor, country struggling, it can approach other countries, it can approach governments in other countries, it can approach international institutions, non-government organizations, anybody that is involved in providing financial aid or financial assistance to countries in need. All right. So both foreign countries, your governments, international institutions, NGOs, there's a lot of people, institutions that are involved in activities like providing financial aid, making grants, giving grants to different countries that are in need, borrowing money to countries that need it. Our government borrowed a lot of money now for the COVID thing. and rendering free services. But now, very important, obviously, any such financing is scarce. Okay, they don't have unlimited sources of financing. So these organizations, when they have to decide which country it is that they would like to provide assistance to, obviously they need to choose that country very carefully. And they will obviously base their decision on indicators. Now, they can't just say, okay, I feel, or any, mini, miny, mo, I choose this one. They literally study different types of indicators. So, and each institution will obviously choose the indicators that they wish to consider. Okay, but things that they would look at, for example, is domestic income, expenditure, production, or aggregates. They would look at poverty. They would look at education, health data. They look at the living standards of countries. And then obviously they will make a decision based on that. Now, they need to give financial assistance to the countries that need it the most. And to identify the countries that need it the most, they look at certain indicators. All right. Now, we have spoken about lots of economic and social indicators in those afternoon lessons. So we have done that, but there are certain indicators that have been added. Okay, so additional things that they look at. They don't purely just look at the economic and social indicators. In addition to that, they do look at that, but in addition to that, also they look at human rights. Okay, so they are not likely to provide financial aid to a government whose country doesn't respect human rights. All right, so where children rights, labor rights, any kind of gender discrimination, racial discrimination, crime rates, these things will affect people's human rights. So if they feel that human rights are not being respected in a particular country, they are less likely to make financing available to the government of that country, because they feel that the government is not going to use that money to promote the rights of the people in the country. Okay, then they look at environmental indicators like pollution, ecosystem destruction, threatened animal species. Now, do we look after our biodiversity? Do we look after our water resources to see whether we are caring for the environment in a sustainable way? Because also they are less likely to provide financing to governments that have a complete disregard for the environment. Now, environmental sustainability is very much a focus area nowadays. So they are less likely to provide financing if the government doesn't seem to care about environmental sustainability. And then lastly, very importantly, is they look at certain governance indicators. So they look at how exactly the country is being run. Okay, specifically they look at corruption and nepotism. They look at the consistency in service delivery in terms of water and electricity. They look at the justice systems. Now, how do we deal with the crime rates in the countries? How many arrests are being made? How many prosecutions goes through the courts, convictions, the frequency of elections, if your elections is being held democratically, because again, they are less likely to give money to a government that is found to be corrupt, because they provide financial assistance and the government uses that money then for their own gain instead of it benefiting the people that actually need it the most. All right. So in addition to all the social and economic indicators that we have done, they also look at human rights, environmental indicators, and then governance indicators to determine whether they are going to provide financial aid to a particular country or not. All right. And then the last thing, and this is then the end of chapter 11, is they do comparisons and forecasting. All right, now with capital markets, remember we said the idea is free trade. Capital markets have been liberalized as well. People are free to make investments wherever. And if I have money that I would like to invest, I can invest it in South Africa, but I can also invest it anywhere in the world. And as an investor, I'm going to invest my money where I can earn the best returns. Any investor wants a return on their investment. So I'm going to invest my money in whatever investment in whatever country I need to in order to earn the best returns, the best interest rates, the best profits, etc., etc. All right, so multinationals and speculators, investors, will move their capital to their advantage. They are basically going to compare different options all the time. Okay, once I've made an investment, I'm also free to withdraw my investment and to go and invest my money somewhere else. So we, as investors, they look at the different conditions that are prevalent in different countries. They look at the economic and social, but mostly focusing for investments on economic indicators to consider which investment option is best. All right. And publications that are prepared for these global operators, for global international investors, they give the indicator values for 3 of the previous years and 3 years into the future. so that obviously trends can be spotted. Okay, if we have 3 previous years indicators and we do a forecast of the 3 next years, we can get a good idea of where that indicator is moving. Okay, if economic growth is increasing or not, if interest rates tend to be going up or down, etc., etc. All right, so these international indicators include the key economic indicators like we discussed. When we did the economic and the social indicators, they will make a study of all of those indicators, or they will pick certain indicators that obviously relates to their investment the best, and they would like to see how they can think. They would like to make a prediction about how they think their investment is going to perform based on how it has performed in the previous 3 years and what the forecast is for the coming 3 years. And they will obviously take their investment to a country where they feel their investment is going to give them the best returns. But obviously we need to compare these indicators to make a choice. They compare different indicators of different countries that they see as a possibility, and they will base their choices on what those indicators are doing. Without the indicators, they would not be able to make an informed decision. All right, now this section was the end of chapter 11 then. And just remember, this is not an essay question. They can use this for 2 or 4 marks in a data response question, short questions, 8-mark discuss questions even, and maybe even the additional part to an essay question. All right.